right, everyone. Welcome to this episode of Life.Examined Skype Sessions. We are Life.Examined. What we are is a group of philosophers and thinkers who take up different topics and different ideas in order to try and get to the core, the bottom of what is our philosophical ethos. And what we mean by that is what are the things that inform how we think, how we live, the concrete things we do in our daily lives. And we try to dig down and pull out some interesting philosophical ideas and put them into dialogue with that. And tonight we're going to continue on with our Life.Examined sessions, and we have a special guest with us. Josh.
Absolutely, yes. We've got a friend of mine that I've known for quite a number of years from London. His name is Chi Chi, and we'll let him introduce himself in just a second, talk a little bit about what he does. And Miriam's just going to introduce a little bit about how we're going to go about approaching the subject for tonight.
Very nice. Oh, sorry, Miriam, after you.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So we've got a topic. Today's topic, Joshua brings today's topic, and it's, I'm not prepared at all, but that's a good thing, because what we want to do is, be able to talk about, just about anything that is important in our lives, and to create a kind of community of inquiry, where together we're thinking out loud, and the thought itself, and like daring to go where the thought leads us. And the thought itself is more important than who says it. So it's not a battle of the egos, but more like a trying to reach wisdom together by talking out loud together.
Good.
So that's what we're doing. Chi Chi, who are you?
Hello, everyone. I'm Chi Chi Obuaya. I'm a consultant psychiatrist. I work in the national health system and in private practice in London. And Josh and I used to be neighbours, so it's nice to be reunited.
Yeah,
today.
it's been a few years. Good. So I'll just throw out this rough topic. We haven't really gotten into too much into what we're going to talk about tonight beforehand. So it was just an idea. Chi Chi works as a psychiatrist, and we're philosophers, Miriam and Matthew and I work mostly in research right now that looks into autonomous vehicles and people. And so this idea has been in my mind for quite a while, thinking about interdependence or dependence. And I guess what I mean by that is that there are all kinds of ways that we are dependent on things around us, on each other, on our food, on all kinds of things in good and healthy ways. And there's ways that we're dependent on things in unhealthy ways. So I just wanted to sort of get into thinking about this idea of dependence or interdependence. So that would be where two things depend on each other. And just think about that idea. I mean, there are a lot of examples of where things are dependent on something else. This could be conceptually. Two ideas could be dependent on each other, or it could be psychologically, or it could be in other ways. So I just want to sort of explore that idea of dependence and interdependence and see what comes out of a discussion about it.
Can I throw a question back to you to start out, just definitionally?
Yeah.
Independence, does that play in this discussion anywhere? Yeah. Is that the contrast or the opposite of dependence, or is independence also the opposite of interdependence?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's part of what's brought it up is so I could talk about a particular project that's working on where there's a common argument for something like a self-driving car, and one of the arguments for why this would be a good thing socially is the idea is that it makes people more independent, and the idea there is that they're able to move about their environment without any dependency on somebody else, because they're able to order the car, it takes them where they want to go, and so on. So oftentimes they're put forward as a kind of that they're against each other. You're either dependent, and that's negative, or you're independent, and that's positive. That's the way that it's oftentimes talked about. I mean, of course, there's many different scenarios where you could talk about this, but oftentimes that's the way it's put forward, that these are opposites, and one is good and one is bad. And that seems problematic to me, I suppose. So definitionally, oftentimes they're seen as being opposites, but I don't, and one is seen as being negative, that is dependence, and one is seen as being positive, independence. And I'm not sure if that's the case. It doesn't seem to really work all the way out, I think.
I'd agree. And when you threw out this as a topic, I'll tell you what I initially thought. I thought, this year is the perfect time to be talking about our dependence on each other.
Yeah.
Because I think this is at the heart of the crisis that we're going through as individuals collectively, which is that certainly in the Western world, you gave the example of autonomous cars. We've had innovations, advances in society, which maybe create this illusion of independence. And it's not entirely an illusion. There are certainly things that we can do to survive and go about our business in our own little bubble, dare I say it. That's one of the words of 2020. And I feel that the pandemic has been a real lesson for us in bringing home how dependent we are on each other, and the fact that there's something important about the relationships we develop, and the need to remain connected to people and to rely on people. So technically speaking, I'm classed as a key worker in the UK, and we get special dispensation because we're in the middle of a lockdown still. And as a key worker, there's a little bit more movement that one is entitled to. But even that question, what is a key worker? I happen to be a healthcare professional, but I'd argue that the person who delivers my post or who stays in the supermarket so that we can all buy our food, and you can just keep going with that argument. And the point is that we are dependent on each other to do the different things that we do. This year's been, I think, very humbling in that sense, because there's a drive for us to be more independent, but actually the fragility and the vulnerability that we have has really been exposed, and maybe we need to embrace the interdependence we have much more so than we have within certainly Western culture.
Nice.
That's super good, because I think what we're getting at here is something very interesting. The raising the question of what do we assume has been the de facto position of the human person. And I think as you said, this pandemic has revealed to us that our de facto position is actually a position of dependency. And I don't know what that means about independence, if it's in fact something of an illusion, or if we can talk about independence in certain contexts, in certain ways. But there's a whole history, for example, of if I want to throw in care ethics, of talking about our natural position as human beings is the position in these relationships with one another. In fact, our ontology, our very being, is intertwined with others in such a way that that's the starting point. That is our natural position as human beings. To get to a point of individuality and independence is actually quite a massive jump of abstraction that's required to get there.
Do you mean that we kind of have our natural state would be one of sort of being enmeshed in a context with others and so on? But
absolutely. So I guess relationally, ethically, morally, but even ontologically, as far as our very nature as beings is socially intertwined with others.
So, but that raises another question, which is. So what I pointed to, that oftentimes the idea of interdependence is put in opposition to dependence, that there's a kind of move towards interdependence as being a move in a positive way. I'm not sure if it's necessarily in a moral way, but maybe. So I guess one question would be, though it might be true that we are born into a state of interdependence, that of course doesn't justify that's a good state to be in. So a further question is it good to stay in that state, or should we do the most we can to try and make it so that people are more independent?
I have a view on this. A perspective. A view, a perspective, something. So we, instead of instead of getting lost in whether independence is a good or bad thing, I mean, we can imagine that two independent, if you can put two in front of it, it means that it can go to excess. But something that we can talk about is something like autonomy and authenticity and integrity and these words, because if you can define yourself, you can be interdependent. Otherwise, it's not interdependence; it's something else. It's dependence, or it's like symbiosis or something like that. But to be to do while you're working on your autonomy and your authenticity and integrity. I mean, integrity means to integrate, like all the different parts of me. And like some psychoanalyst once said, so beautifully put, we are members of each other. And in that way, we have always these little pieces of other people in us, and our tentacles is going out to other people as well, So in that we can, so in that way, the relational aspect is always there. Otherwise, it's solipsism. I'm the only person who exists here, and all of you are in my imagination. So in that way, you can to be an autonomous person who is capable of interdependence. That sort of together with those comes the willingness to serve. You know what I mean? Like to always imagine what am I going to do? Who with? Like who for? Who with? The other person is always. You see?
You're saying we require a certain amount of differentiation of dependence from one another as subjects to be able then to relate to and care for one another. Is that essentially?
Yeah, like we need to separate to be united. That this wonderful paradox about the oneness of all, that you have to understand yourself as a part of the whole, but that requires a lot of that is to be authentic, is to figure out what your part is. Who am I in all of this? And that's another thing I thought about with Corona situation in the world, that it's kind of like this new person a new me has emerged, and for me it was a really positive experience. Like, who am I when there's a crisis in the world? And I noticed that all of my normal problems, like the things that we do here at home and the things that used to annoy me, or the feelings nobody listens to me, or I want to be angry, or whatever, these things that we all bring, they kind of faded, all of them. And now I'm ready to do this bigger thing. So this new me emerged, and it has a lot to do with wanting to serve, wanting to be a part of my community, my society, wanting to build like the new world kind of thing. And this also means not just asking like, how do I feel about things? That's an important part. That's a part of understanding my who I am and my position, my authenticity, but also to ask like, what would I like to contribute with? Like, who do I want to be in this? Yeah.
But it would be fascinating to see what people would have said this time last year, compared to now in that regard. Absolutely. Because I think that's a huge insight that you've just revealed there, Miriam, in that even defining oneself is in the context of other people, and that's a huge step for a lot of people. And I don't know that for our generation that's the way in which a lot of people have interacted and engaged with the world. But I think it's something that for a lot of people has hit home, and it's one of the important narratives to come out of this year.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if I could throw a question over to you, Chi Chi. It only took us about 14 minutes for me to bring up the word paradox here, but it seems like when we talk about this issue, there seems to be a fundamental paradox here, that we are at the same time dependent and independent. But once again, to talk about this issue in that way is to fall back into a binary. And there's a lot of philosophers who are quite skeptical of these kind of binaries. And I'm wondering if that way of thinking about it as a sort of paradoxical relationship of dependence and independence is the way in which you would talk about it in your field, or if you have other ways of conceptualizing this dynamic.
I don't know that I give a direct answer to the question, but in trying to do so, I was reflecting on what Miriam was saying, and I was almost critiquing the approach that we tend to take as psychiatrists and psychotherapists and psychologists. Of course, we offer a range of therapies, but we do focus a lot on the individual. And we focus on what their worries are, how they're defining themselves, what's concerning them. And yes, it's in the context of, say, an individual within a marriage or an individual who's a parent. But we do focus a lot on that person, as we tend to define that individual and their own needs. There's something about the language of this season in that we're trying to, and we do encourage people to be outward focused, but I think we're becoming more intentional in doing that. But I just wonder whether there's a fundamental flaw in the way in which we're approaching things therapeutically, and that we offer group therapy, and you develop insights about how someone is in a group therapeutic context, but still the evaluation, I would argue, and maybe I'm wrong in saying so, is, okay, so person A, this is what's going on for them,
sure, and
here's some things about person B. And I just wonder whether we do enough to promote this very idea that even how we define ourselves needs to have this society-wide viewpoint that we can refer to as being a healthy dependence on others.
That's really. Can I just pick up, because I think that's a really
everybody
interesting.
Everyone wants to pick up on that. Go ahead.
We have a subset of personality disorders, a dependent personality disorder.
What does that mean?
So it just means that.
Yeah.
So personality disorders refer to ingrained patterns of behavior that arise usually in adolescence and persist into one's adult life. So there are issues around self-identity, interpersonal relationships, and there are many subsets. So dependent personality disordered individual is someone who would, it's ironic saying it even, who would struggle, who would sort of latch on to other individuals. So in a therapeutic context, to myself or a colleague, and they struggle to then have a greater sense of independence and not to be reliant on others. So even as I'm saying it, I'm sort of questioning. Now, clearly there are some people who, I guess, are over-reliant on others for meeting their emotional needs, but perhaps, again, that's something that we need to think about, that we're in our diagnostic labels, we're even being critical of people who might naturally lean towards others in defining who they are, which goes back to Miriam's point.
It sounds I can because my idea connects with this. So it sounds a little bit like that's it partly relates to Maslow's hierarchy, right? Where as you go up in terms of your hierarchy, you get more independent, and the top is to be sort of a fully independent individual.
No, but to transcend.
Well,
self-transcendence.
Yes, but it's also, yes, that's true. But it's as an individual in that process.
Yeah.
But what's interesting, what I want to pick up on is a word that you used, Miriam, which was autonomy, and I guess it relates to this, what you just mentioned, Chi Chi, the disordered personality, disordered personality of dependence, right? Where one way of saying it might be that they have no autonomy. Yeah. So, but the idea of autonomy is just such a fundamental idea in our society, and it's maybe not all bad, right? But it's an interesting notion. So I guess I could phrase it this way: is a person able to be fully authentically autonomous while being independent or being interdependent on others? Or is the very notion of being autonomous one that includes an idea of independence, that I choose on my own what to do? I mean, that's a notion of independence, or a sort of personal freedom. You might put it that way.
Right. I mean, if you're trying to connect connect autonomy to what Miriam's talking about as far as integrity, then I think, when we talk about autonomy emerging from this Western tradition of rights, and there are certain rights that the individual, that should not be impeded upon, should not be taken away. There's a certain integrity. There's a certain respect for the person, if we want to talk in Kantian terms. That seems to connect very well. But by autonomy we mean utter absolute freedom, disconnected from all other influences. It seems like I have a hard time imagining autonomy in that sense, because that seems to be a vacuous concept. But I'm connecting it more to what Miriam's saying with integrity in that sense.
And I want to go back to Chi Chi's line of work and think, but to me it suddenly becomes, the question is, what does it mean to be a healthy person? Because I've just been reading about also personality disorders, and I read briefly that someone said if you take a schizophrenic person and put them on an island, they are still schizophrenic and they have their symptoms and their worldview. But if you take a borderline personality and put them on an island, they might not show any symptoms, because for a borderline personality, the problem is always in relation to another person.
Can you just describe? I don't know what borderline means.
The borderline is another word is unstable personality disorder. That's the Swedish translation, and it's about 2% of everyone, so it's quite a lot of people. In ranges from mild to not so mild anymore, and it's a kind of black and white worldview where you either hate or you love someone, and sometimes it's described as like the feeling hemophilia, where everything just goes up. You get so angry and you're just all angry. And then I just listened to a seminar about this, that's why it's fresh in my mind. And what did he say, the guy? He said that in many psychological disorders, the question is epistemological, like how do I understand things like my feelings, and what is dangerous and what is not dangerous, and what is the world, what are the defining the things in the world. But for borderline, it's an ethical displacement. So you can have in the same. So for instance, a borderline personality can go and get so angry that they hit someone, and then they say, "Well, I was angry." In the same way as you say, "I was hungry, so I ate a sandwich." But it's like wrong. It's wrong to hit someone. So the problem is ethical. I found this so intensely interesting. But bringing back to today's topic, so the key point was that personality disorders, relational personality disorders, which of course have to do with things like dependence on other people, attachment to how you attach, and with a borderline personality, it's a fear of abandonment that is frantically played out over and over by, for instance, abandoning or hurting another person or threatening to leave and things like that. A very dramatic kind of thing, but it's all about the relation, and it's so this is the kind of I don't know what my point was here, but it's the threads that I want to pull are something like, what's a healthy person? There's something healthy, I feel, in the word interdependence, or at least we can use it to create an image of health among humans, or something like that. And we also use we use other words like autonomy and integrity. Where you don't let people overstep your boundaries, and you also let people have their own feelings, but you have an ethical. You see what I'm saying? Like all of these things seem to be intertwined at the moment. But now I've talked for a really long time. It
feels that I think we are converging on a theme here, and it goes back to the point Josh was making. There's a danger, and perhaps the bit that we're getting wrong is that, given that scenario you've just described, Miriam, the error is to say, well, the answer is to help this person to be more autonomous, to figure stuff out for themselves, and not to rely on people. And actually where we need to get people to is that healthy balance of understanding what integrity is, understanding, and in some cases making people more autonomous, yes, because their emotions are being played out in interpersonal interactions, and that's the unhealthy bit. It's not the fact that they have relationships or dependence on others. It's that they're unhealthy in how they manifest. So perhaps we've lulled ourselves into this mistaken belief that the answer is, well, if everyone can just sort themselves out, be a bit more independent and get on with their lives, they're going to be 80% of the way there. I just wonder whether that's a mistake that we're making, a sort of unintended consequence of the approach that we're taking to supporting people, certainly in my field.
Right.
What do you think of ethics? Like the wanting to do the right thing, or asking the patient, what's the right thing to do? Like to develop this kind of, what do you think about that? That's like, it was new to me to see it from that perspective.
Well, I think one of the danger of certainly the group of people we've been talking about who might be defined as having personality disorder is that their ability to understand what the right thing to do through no fault of their own is actually compromised. So it's an interesting question. There's nothing wrong with asking it, but it's, in some cases, it's going to be futile. In someone that can't fully think through, because we're talking about integrity, and it's the integrity in the sense that how do I define myself, and what actually belongs to the world, and where do the two interact, and what then is socially appropriate in terms of my behavior.
So is this a line? Is ethics a sign of health? Is it the sign of health? How interesting. I
mean, this is, I wonder if I can jump in here and ask a question as well to you, Chi Chi, that it's, and we've talked in this group quite a bit about virtue ethics. And the question I was going to ask you is, when we want to give a sort of criteria for what it means to be a healthy person, and then we use these concepts of dependency or independency as a way of trying to help somebody become a healthy person, what is informing that concept or that definition of healthy? Because it seems, depending on which cultural categories you're drawing on, you're going to have it skewed more or less to one of these polarities. And I guess your question about ethics is interesting, Miriam, because if we want to talk about drawing in something like virtue ethics of flourishing, human flourishing, can we draw in that as a way of informing what we mean by healthy? So we don't get stuck, for example, saying, well, the healthy person in Sweden is the person who is utterly independent from family, from religion, from everything except for the state. And then that's what it means to be a healthy person, which we've seen play out in Sweden is not actually a very healthy way to live. So once again, if I can reframe the question here, when we talk about a normal healthy person, what's informing those categories? What are we looking to define that? And can we draw on ethical frameworks to help us get a better conception of that?
The short answer would be society defines that. However you want to define society, because we accept that for a lot of the conditions I might diagnose as a psychiatrist, these are behavioral syndromes. Some of them are black and white, but the vast majority of them probably occur on a spectrum of behavior. And so there has to be a cutoff. And collectively, a consensus of people will say that is abnormal, that is unhealthy.
Right.
And we do have revisions of our diagnostic criteria. So you will see over a 10 to 15 year period, 20 years, some of those definitions do change. I guess we tend not to think about ethics in response to one of the themes that's come up. We would think about the concept perhaps of insight as being one of the key factors. So if we take a scenario that maybe all four of us agree, Miriam, you gave the example of punching somebody because you felt upset. we might accept that that's socially unacceptable. And the key point you want to get the person to in that scenario is having insight such that they can recognize, it is socially acceptable to eat when I'm hungry, but every time I'm angry, I cannot punch someone. There are consequences of doing so. That might include getting in trouble from a legal perspective. You can upset people, you can scare people. So I guess there are overlapping themes there, and we would term it as insights, where you're able to think for yourself, this is the way to behave in a given scenario. This is, these are examples of things I'm doing which suggest I'm not quite being my normal self, however that's defined. And that's one of the things we try to assist people with, certainly.
Right. I guess my concern is just that I mean, if we take the American context as an example here, there seems to be a shift in certain normalization of certain behaviors. We've become more accepting of certain behaviors as quote unquote normal. And I'm concerned that there's a drift in a certain direction, and that is informing what we're talking about as a normal functioning human being. And I think I want to push back on that and say there's got to be ethical, philosophical criteria that we can use to try and engage with that drift in a certain way, so we don't fall into some sort of cultural relativistic definition of what it means to be a healthy human being. So I guess I got the sort of universalist in me pushing back a bit.
But I can see that there's a little bit of a tension in terms of something which is like a professionalized practice, right? Which has regulations, which has processes that to bring things forward. And I mean, there's all kinds of institutional frameworks that go into play for something like that. But then you have a meta question, which is how do you evaluate those processes? And of course, then I guess there's a universalist tendency in me as well, thinking that there's got to be a way of critiquing that. So then you go to, but then that might be outside of the discipline, right? So there's multiple disciplines. There's different disciplines that ask different questions, and so on. But then that's quite interesting. That raises another kind of dependence, right? And I think that
the disciplines are dependent upon each other.
There's disciplinary interdependence, because on their own, right? They borrow. Different disciplines borrow concepts and ideas from other disciplines that they interact with. So they're not isolated. I mean, you can't just have one discipline by itself. So there's, kind of dependence there as well.
There's also codependence. That's another very bad thing. It's usually used when you're codependent with someone who has a
you support their bad. But I mean, that's interesting to call it co as opposed to inter. I mean, what's the difference really in terms of interdependence is a positive thing maybe, but codependence is not.
We definitely think of codependence as being unhealthy. So I think the key there is to drill down to what are the elements of that relationship that make it unhealthy. And it's not a simple thing. What we're effectively doing is critiquing a narrative which maybe promotes independence as something for people to aspire to. But we need to be careful, and we're not saying that the opposite then is just to be dependent. It's about healthily embracing relationships. And the problem with codependence is that there's a very unhealthy nature to that. So there can be things like collusion in unhelpful behavior, and
what do you mean by collusion?
For example, if you're doing something that is socially unacceptable, and I'm too scared to confront you, and I effectively say, well, Josh, that's great. You only punched one person today because you used to punch 3 people every day. I'm actually not really addressing the issue there, and I'm reinforcing.
It wasn't the number of people that was the issue.
Come on, why not 10, Josh, you wimp?
So yeah, you may get the wrong impression, and actually, what I'm doing is not helping you, but reinforcing the maladaptive behavior.
Interesting, yeah.
Yeah.
But this is fascinating to me because I think there is a lot more interconnection between the disciplines than we want to say here. Because, I mean, this is an empirical study. It's probably already been done, but this is an empirical study that we need to do. Chi Chi, you need to head this one up. Is if you look at all the different practitioners in your field, in your culture, I would imagine that when they are talking about certain behaviors and actions that will lead to a healthy life, if you start to actually take those apart and look at them, I bet there's some interesting crossover. We'd be able to pull out certain factors and criteria that would actually, all of you are in fact circling around in one way or another. I would imagine that a practitioner who is wildly outside of that norm would not be a very successful practice. I could imagine.
Sure, but the reason I speak with a degree of trepidation is that there's usually a bit of pushback against psychiatry as a discipline, because the argument is that we don't have any more right than anybody else to define what is normal and abnormal. And I guess we run into this grey area because we can move away from what we already have, which is controversial, which is defining, well, what constitutes illness and mental illness specifically.
Yeah.
And then we go into this territory of, okay, we're not saying someone is ill, but what's healthy for that individual? And do we have a right to intervene, to help people? And broadly speaking, psychologists and psychotherapists are there to assist people who either directly or indirectly, and indirectly I mean maybe their spouse or their son or daughter is pushing them to get help, but people who on some level want some assistance to understand their behavior and to optimize relationships, their interaction with the world. But do we then have a right to start picking people out and labeling them as abnormal members of society because we don't like the way in which they're going about their business?
That raises
that's the danger.
Yeah. I mean, there's always the pushback every time a new edition of the DSM comes out. There's always a massive discussion about that, about what's in it, what's not in it, why or why not.
I mean, you raised a couple interesting concepts. One is having a right. What is included in that? But it's interesting because in China right now they're instigating social behavior point system where you're allotted a certain score based on your social behavior, and they use face tracking and AI to measure your behavior in public context, and then your score can go up or down. So they've institutionalized that process very effectively, where your behavior can be marked by being socially unacceptable in some ways, because your score can go down, and if it's in a bad state, then you'll have to go to a psychiatrist. I mean, it's bordering on that kind of sort of management of behavior. And then there's maybe problems with that.
But I mean, I find it's a fascinating comment though that in some sense you're not allowed to make normative claims about what is normal, what ought to be, but yet that's still in the background for informing the practice in some sense. That's an interesting dynamic for me. That it seems like there's. I'm trying to get my head around that.
Oh well, isn't that maybe part of it too? That because you said there's a fundamental exchange that goes on where there's a tacit agreement that the individual has asked for help. So it's based in the individual. It's based in the individual's autonomy. The person wants help to act in a particular way, and that's what gives then somebody in the permission to be able to help them, because they have tacitly either directly or through somebody else asked for this help.
Yeah.
That or that they are a danger to their own life or someone else's life.
I was going to say there are some caveats, because that's probably more for people that sit in that, if you like, the middle tier, which is where we're not saying they're frankly unwell. Some of them may be, but they are struggling in some aspects of their life and therefore are seeking some help. Whereas at the more severe end, which is where someone like myself definitely comes into play, society needs to intervene to say that this person is a danger to themselves or to others, and without some intervention, there will be some untoward consequence. So there's also a spectrum of interventions.
So I mean that's also a very Lockean idea, right? That the justification for the state prohibiting some individual's freedom is in a way only stands on that person's freedom might interfere in in society's freedom. So if you're a danger to others, we can stop you. If you're not a danger to others, then the state doesn't have any right to interfere. Well, but yourself counts as somebody in society, I suppose, in that regard.
Yeah, it's a nice thought that you are able to hurt yourself. It's a very interesting philosophical idea.
I mean, there's debates about that as well, right? I mean, go to the Netherlands where you have a right to suicide as well, right? So I mean, there's debate about how far that extends, and if you're only a danger to yourself, does that give, or debates about whether or not it should be a mandate or a law that you wear a motorcycle helmet when you ride a motorcycle, because wearing a motorcycle helmet protects the individual, it doesn't protect other people. So is that a requirement or not? Should the state enforce a law like that?
Or a mask.
Or a mask.
Yes.
And now we're into interesting territory.
Yeah. Very interesting.
Right. But I mean,
and it's really interesting actually when you think about masks, because it's the very theme of what we're talking about. The mask doesn't protect you. It protects other people. And it's that sense that it's not all about you, and that you have a responsibility as a member of society to engage with other people, to take on some responsibility for other people. It's a great example of how all of these issues just come to the surface, and they're very emotive, clearly, as we've seen.
But we're in Sweden. We don't wear masks here.
I know. It's fascinating too, because like depending on how, but you're absolutely right, Chi Chi, because depending on how the government and the health services have framed the risks of infection, so that's what makes the difference, I think, right? So it depends on how you interpret the sparse data we have, and how you take that in terms of your categories of risk behavior. Then you use that to make your policies. So then the policy is, well, you need to do this because it minimizes risk to others. So it's based on exactly this idea, like you said, Chi Chi. It comes up to the fore.
And that's really good what you said, Chi Chi, though, that it's not as if our responsibility to others takes form in our mask wearing. There is a sense of responsibility already there. Then we have to have the discussion about what is the best way in which then to play out our responsibility to others in society. But being placed within society, we are already responsible to one another. The face of the other is already making a demand upon us.
I've got a good example. I don't know if Miriam and Matthew, if you heard this the other day, but some official in the Swedish government got quite irritated just the other day because it came to light that with to test whether or not you have COVID-19, that a number of younger people, we could leave it that way, a number of younger people were using these tests to make sure that they were not positive so that they could go out and party. And she was very irritated because she was saying, look, I mean, there's a limited number of tests. Like this is using it in a way that is completely frivolous. It should be used for somebody that needs to find out if they have COVID in some important way. This is not important. And that really is quite interesting because it turns on that idea of like, well, I'm going to use this to make sure I'm okay so I can do what I want to do, right? Like, or should I let somebody else use it. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's really not. I mean, it's really not that different of a discussion than a lot of the other issues that we don't even talk about. How we carry ourselves on the streets, how we drive, for example, all sorts of behaviors and actions that we do that we just take for granted. And these are ways in which to carry out our responsibility to others. It's odd that this mask issue has become such a hot issue in certain circles, because in some sense it's a part of a larger phenomenon that we already accept our responsibility to others, and that there are certain ways in which that plays out. But it's become very political.
Yeah. But the question then becomes, have we, particularly I think over this generation, moved away from some of those assumptions? Is that how people are actually living, or has it become a bit more of a rat race, and people are just focused on cocooning themselves to the greatest extent, engaging, yes, in society, but in a way that is very self-centered and is about achieving what the individual can achieve to the highest level. I mean, we in some cases at the expense of others.
Yeah, I mean, that's the way we've built a lot of the services that we have. I mean, we've Amazon, Google, Facebook, the usual bad guys these days, right? I mean, we've built a system that is specifically designed for you to get the thing that you want as quick as possible. I mean, it's designed around your own desires, and it's designed to captivate those desires as well. So I mean,
to reinforce them, so that you always only get what you already want. And you always only hear your own perspective. But I wanted to, since the topic is interdependence, and then Chi Chi said something about when you diagnose and in relationship to patients, you always look at what in this relationship is healthy or unhealthy. So we can check, like, if we want to end this by imagining the kind of interdependence that we would like and that is healthy. So what would it be? What would it include? Like, I'm not saying we need to describe it, of course, but what are some important things in a healthy interdependence, in healthy interdependence in the society where we would like to live? Like, what do we do there? How do we? What are the most important concepts, the most important questions that we ask ourselves, the things that we do? What do we do every day in a place like that? For example, like if we make this a thought experiment. So autonomy is important, but if we define it, how do we talk about autonomy? So it's like to the extent that it's possible, you are able to take care of your own basic needs. Like, I'm thinking as a parent, when my 12-year-old asks me to make her breakfast, I'm like, you can do that yourself. And she can. But I mean, if that is a kind of, I mean, autonomy that's a silly example, obviously. But so in a way, this is being able to discern where is my responsibility here in this situation right now, and then and the deep knowledge that everyone else is also a person who.
Well, given that Josh absolutely eviscerated the tech giants a few minutes ago, I'm gonna say something nice about them.
Because they are watching us at this.
Yeah, they are. We're using them to upload them.
Being recorded, all kinds of information's been gathered on us. But the late Steve Jobs was the person who coined that phrase of making a dent in the universe. And so maybe my response to that question would be, and it's hard to get away from issues like what's an individual's sense of purpose, but what is it that you are doing, that you plan to do, that you have done, that demonstrates that you've made a dent in the universe, however you as an individual define it? That would be my question.
That's interesting. But then there's going to be, but then we're going to want flourishing, but we're going to want some kind of parameters about what kind of dent that could be, because
not like an explosion.
Well, you might, it depends on what kind of explosion. I mean, you might make, or when that explosion goes off, right? I mean, you might make a dent in the universe. That's a very significant dent. That's no good. That we would say is not a good dent to leave.
But I think the key thing that you're trying to pick up is that an individual has a sense of the world that isn't completely self-centered. Yes, I absolutely agree, because you can create whatever narrative you like, and it goes back to the concept of insight. Objectively, if you were to get a panel of people in the room, would they classify that dent that you've made as something that's been positive and to the betterment of society, or actually has it just been a way of you boosting your own ego, and you create a nice story around it? But I think by asking the question, you at least get a sense of how that person sees the world, and you then interrogate it further. And it might be something extremely small scale, but highly impactful. Yeah. And I'd possibly argue that those are the things that potentially are going to be more powerful examples than the fact that you're a world leader and in your mind you're having this influence over millions of people or billions, but actually it might still be even more about you in that instance than someone who's sweeping the street, but actually is thinking about preventing an accident for their neighbour and keeping them safe.
Good.
Nice.
Oh, I'm thinking about. I just have a quick thing. I think I brought it up earlier. This American psychologist now dead called David Hawkins, and he said something. He writes about levels of consciousness, and you can use consciousness in many ways, but he talks about it as like love is a level of consciousness, and shame is a level of consciousness, a very low one, like the lowest one. And then when he says that when you're living in a high level of consciousness, you don't mind doing cleaning jobs or like starting from the bottom in a new place, because you can always bring that kind of energy to wherever you are. So this is also the kind of way where how we measure dents is we need to like look over that and see how we can measure these dents in the universe in a broader way, like sweeping the floors and having this higher level of consciousness in the way he talks about it.
If I could jump in, Miriam, and just try to answer your question without giving too much here, but I mean, in his book 2 Ages, Kierkegaard talks about what happens in a society when you lose the ideal. And he describes it beautifully, how people inside a society begin to turn against one another and sort of backbiting, infighting, which I think is actually a really nice picture of the dynamic that's actually playing out in the American context right now. And I guess for me, a picture of interdependence when functioning well would be, maybe something closer to Aristotle's account of virtuous friendship, when we are striving together to help one another pursue the good and to successfully take a step further in that direction. And I think, in fact, the description that you were giving, Chi Chi, is really nice. That doesn't have to be this massive, highfalutin thing. I mean, it can be in a very small, simple acts that we can do for one another, with the presupposition that we are trying to do this in order to help others that we are in relation to become better people, to become more virtuous, to pursue the good in a more successful way than they did perhaps the day before. Yeah. That to me is a good picture of interdependency in response to the collapse of functioning interdependency.
Nice. I think we're kind of wrapping everything up right here. It sounds really good. I don't know if I have so much more to add other than just saying that sounds really good.
Pursuing the good. Yeah.
Pursuing the good. Well, I guess you could say, I think the only thing I could add is to say that I think there are hidden sides of interdependence that we often don't see as being good things, but they are good things. And maybe, like Chi Chi, you mentioned earlier that 2020 has raised some of those up to the fore, and all of a sudden we realize, oh wait, it doesn't work so well to be just on our own entirely, or to pursue that sort of at the cost of all other things. And that seems a good thing. Maybe this is a kind of righting of the ship a little bit, and we'll take a little bit more concern for our dependence on each other and interdependence. But I think that's a pretty good place to finish up the conversation.
Absolutely.
Any last thoughts, or should we just end it there?
Yeah, that was nice.
Chi Chi, do you have any final thoughts?
I'm just nervous that I've been critical of colleagues, and
no.
I wonder whether it's just about us challenging our thinking about whether we're promoting just with good intentions, but along the wrong lines, promoting autonomy and not embracing interdependence enough, because it can be healthy. And I think it's just about getting the balance right. That's been the key insight for me.
Excellent. Nice. Excellent.
Yeah. These are like, if it was easy, we would already be doing it right. So, yeah.
Absolutely. The quest continues. I think that's a good place to put a period there. We can thank all of you viewers for watching this episode, joining us here in this discussion. We look forward to more of these in the future, and may the discussion continue. Thank you for being here. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.